Hello, everybody. My name is Kenny Townsend. I am the Director of Education and Public Programs at the Robert Russa Moton Museum, located in Farmville, Virginia. And today we have the great opportunity to meet with two individuals, Brian and Kevin McGovern, who are historians. And I will just give them a chance to introduce themselves because I don't want to leave anything out. So, Brian, you want to get us started?
Sure. Brian McGovern. I'm a resident of Gloucester, Virginia. As far as my background is concerned, I have an undergraduate degree in social studies education. I have a master's in history, and I have been both a high school and community college history teacher. Um, and my interest in Moton really started when my wife Beth and I moved here in 2003, and we happened to uh, purchase a home that's about less than 2 miles from Moton's retirement home, which is called Hollyknoll. And at that time in 2003, it was more or less abandoned. And had fallen into some disrepair and had been for a number of years. The immediate past owners, the ones at that time, they had put some resources into it to restore it. It was designated on the National Registry of Historic Places in the 1980s. But it's a beautiful place. So that got me initially interested. And when I went to graduate school, I became very um, interested in doing historical research and possibly, authoring books and articles on historical topics, and started to research Moton, not knowing where it was going to go. And it got to a point where I had such a volume of research and was even conducting interviews, and discovered in this process that there had never been a definitive, full length, comprehensive biography of Dr. Moton, who was in the early 20th century among the most influential figures of the time, and certainly the preeminent leader of the African American community. So I took it upon myself to uh, endeavor to do that and work to get a publisher. And along the way, Kevin became involved with the editing first, and then the research. So we are both now co-authors of the book. So that's where it's going, and I'll give Kevin an opportunity to introduce himself now.
I'm Brian. Before I start, I have to say you suddenly got very dark. I don't know if you want to correct that or not, but you're
Yeah, I'm not sure how that happened.
But
so
anyway,
I can try to work to correct that.
I'm Kevin McGovern. I am Brian's brother, as he said, and I am a producer with West Virginia Public Broadcasting for 30 years now. I have a graduate degree in English and a master's degree in communication. In addition to being a PBS producer for West Virginia Public Broadcasting, I also do freelance writing. I have written stage plays and screenplays, several of each, and have a very short book that was self-published but is on sale locally and on Amazon. And I became involved with Brian writing the book when he requested that I take a look at chapters he was writing, see if I could maybe check out the language and improve it a little bit if I could. And the process has grown into a very interactive and productive relationship, I think. I've joined him in assisting in the research, going through all the chapters, polishing and rewriting as I feel might be necessary, also making comments on content, offering suggestions for additional information that might be helpful in fleshing out the narrative, trying to give it a little dramatic flair whenever I can, taking what is essentially history and trying to make it a little bit more of a story, which I think will make it more appealing to readers. And we've also discussed the possibility that this could eventually be developable, if that's a word, into a screenplay and maybe a motion picture, essentially, ultimately, because this man is a very interesting man, someone who has been overlooked by history, I think. I can see that just even though my familiarity with him is more recent and not as deep as Brian's is, but I can already see the dramatic potential here in telling the story of a man. In my mind, he compares a little bit with Gandhi, who was a very peace-loving, understated sort of man, but a man who was driven by great ideas and who ultimately made a difference, a great difference in history, in his actions and his words and so forth. And that's about where I stand in my development on this. I'm excited to be working with Brian on this. It's a great thing to be working together with him to produce, the first extensive, the first thorough and exhaustive biography on someone who is probably a major and, as I say, overlooked figure in history, who will hopefully be overlooked no longer.
Yeah, and you bring up an interesting point. I work at the Robert Russa Moton Museum, right? And essentially, when they wanted to name this building when it was built in 1939 after a prominent African American figure from Prince Edward County, born in Amelia, moved to Prince Edward County very shortly after. Mm-hmm. And so it's just interesting to me. We tell who he was, right? We give like a rough outline, but most people, you're right. I mean, he is kind of overlooked. And so my question to both of you is, you said Booker T. Washington, and everybody would probably say, yeah, I know, Tuskegee, blah, 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 right? They would know at least a little bit. Why was Robert Russa Moton, has he been historically overlooked in such a impactful individual? Like, why do you both think that he's been overlooked for so
long? Well, I guess I'll speak on that first. I think there are a number of reasons for that. In the latter 20th century, in historiography of African American history and history itself, we got more into what we call the New Left School of History. And there was, I guess you would say, a diminishing of the more conservative philosophy of Booker T. Washington. And because Moton succeeded him, Moton tends to be lumped in with Washington in terms of philosophy. Now, that's very accurate to say when Washington was alive. When Moton took over at Tuskegee, he really in many ways came into his own. He became Washington's successor, but did not operate in the same ways that Washington did, which was, he's been described sometimes, Washington, as a machine politician. Very kind and benevolent and charismatic in many ways. Moton was known to be, and I may be the first person to use this term, I'm not sure, but he was really more of a bridge builder. And the background of this is, for those who may not be familiar, when Booker T. Washington was alive before his death in 1915, he had created and built Tuskegee Institute and got to know Moton in the last about 15 years of his life. But it was during that time that the African American community, in terms of civil rights, more or less split in two. And there were those that followed Booker T. Washington, and they were called Bookerites.
Stop that.
And there were those who followed the radicals. Now, Moton accurately is associated with the Bookerites. But after Washington died and Moton took over at Tuskegee, he really came into his own and became a bit more like the radicals. And really, by the time that he was finished there, those dividing lines between the radicals and the Bookerites were really very much blurred. And it will be argued in the book, as it comes together. We're going to attempt to make the argument that Moton was very influential in blurring those lines. And much of that had to do with the fact Moton tried to bring more unity between those two camps, even when Washington was still alive. He remained friends with some of the radicals, and he had become a very good friend of Washington too. So he kind of really tried to be a mediator between the two. But after he took over, for a number of reasons, those lines were very much blurred. So,
And by the radicals, kind of more W.B. Du Bois.
yes, W.B. Du Bois, William Monroe Trotter was another one. Certainly, eventually Oswald Garrison Villard, Mary White Ovington. They were among the people who helped to found the NAACP. Booker T. Washington very much opposed the creation of the NAACP. But over the course of the next 23 years, by 1932, Moton actually wins the famous Spring Iron Medal that's given out every year by the NAACP. And I look at that as kind of this symbolic and a tangible sign that there was much more unification. And I also see that, at least in part, that by that unification in the years and decades after Washington's death, leading up to Moton's death in 1940, really made the post-World War II civil rights movement possible. Had the African American community still been divided in the 40s and 50s, that movement may not have been possible. So that I think was a lot of Moton's influence, but a lot of it was his personality and character from a young age. He had a knack at getting along with people and to bring people together in disputes as well.
You know, to throw in my a take I have on this kind of thing, I think history does have a natural tendency, or I don't know how natural it is, but it happens, of being sort of biased toward giving most of its or a lot of its attention to more colorful and flamboyant kind of people who kind of stood out in more dramatic ways, and to give less attention, or maybe not as much as it should, to people who simply made very, quieter but very efficient and important contributions. And I think Moton probably falls into that category. I think a lot of those people eventually get recognized, and you see it all the time. You see news stories about this person who's been overlooked in, some contribution they made to history or science, politics, who is finally being recognized. But it takes the world a little bit longer for them to move out from under the shadows of people, people who were more flamboyant and who stood out more for some reason, like Booker T. Washington, to get out of their shadow and finally be recognized. But eventually it tends to happen, fortunately. I think that's maybe what's going to happen with Moton now because of what we're doing.
Yeah. So. We definitely hope so here, because certainly his contributions, and fact check me, I think I've heard he advised like 5 or 6 U.S. presidents in some capacity.
I am actually counting 7 U.S. presidents that he was in some way, shape, or form an advisor to, from Theodore Roosevelt to Franklin Roosevelt. His relationship with Theodore Roosevelt was, they had met at some point in time when Theodore Roosevelt was president. But after Roosevelt left office, Roosevelt was a member of the Board of Trustees at Tuskegee. And it was Theodore Roosevelt, probably more than anybody on the board, or at least Roosevelt, very respected leader at the time, the elder statesman of the Republican Party. He pushed for Moton to be the successor of Booker T. Washington. So that was his relationship, and TR thought thought the world of Moton. He got involved with Taft because they both served on the board of trustees of the Anna T. Jeanes Foundation, which aided the education of African American youths in the South. He certainly, during his presidency and during the First World War, worked with Wilson, worked closely with Harding. I think a little bit less with Coolidge, and to some degree with Hoover, and then Roosevelt was the last president that he worked with. In fact, Roosevelt, of course, was a Democrat. Hoover was a Republican. Moton himself had been a lifelong Republican up to Hoover, and there's a much longer story to it. But Hoover made some promises to Moton that Hoover didn't keep. And in 1932, Moton switched his support for the first time ever that I know of to Franklin Roosevelt, a Democrat.
Is this the first book you both have written?
It's the first book for me. It's not the first book for you, Kevin.
I have a very short, it's actually a long short story published in book form, which is on sale on Amazon. It's a self-published book. A friend of mine encouraged me to do it some years ago. It's a horror story. And it's called The Wind and the Darkness, and it's, Brian just held up a copy of it. And it's about 40 pages long, but it's published in book form, and it's on sale here at the Tamarack Center in West Virginia, and it's also available on Amazon. And I have had several stage plays produced. That's not publication, but it's something you've written being made available to the public. So.
I asked, what has this process been like for you all? What kind of things have you learned from doing it? Was it easier or harder than you thought it would be? Just what kind of is the general writing process kind of been like, and the book production process?
Well, like I said, by 2016 or 17, it got to the point where this looks like it's turning into a book. Mm-hmm. And it has been a very invigorating journey. It has been, as academics will tell you, you're juggling a teaching schedule with research and writing, so that presents challenges. It's really been, for me, and maybe for about half the time for Kevin, it's been about an 8-year journey from the time that I really started to explore and even started to do interviews with people, including the niece of Mrs. Jenny Moton, Moton's niece by marriage, who just passed away in 2018. Got to know her. She adored her Uncle Robert, even though he had been gone from her life for almost 80 years. Her recollections of him were so incredibly vivid. And she knew him as a very young girl, didn't realize that he was really a world famous figure. But he was clearly, and I asked her one time, it sounds like he was the most influential person in your life. And she said, yes, indeed, he was. So it's been a journey of getting to know people. It's been invigorating, not only in learning so much about Moton, but in the fact that we're creating something that has never been created before, and really reintroducing Moton, hopefully, to the world. In Gloucester County, even in Prince Edward and Amelia County, you can ask people and they have never heard of Robert Moton, aside from his name is attached to not only the school there, the most famous one of all, but several other ones in the country. Other than that, they know very little about him today. And as I alluded to before, historians really decide what goes into the history books, and sometimes lawmakers and book publishers decide what goes into history books, and he has been largely left out, as there is a lot of history. There are a lot of historical figures that should be in textbooks and other books who are not. So we're hoping to change that and bring Moton to the forefront, not only in terms of his influence in civil rights, but his character as a person. There are lessons not just in history in general. There are lessons in leadership and character and values that can be derived from studying his life.
As a writer, my take on it, on the process, is that it's an interesting switch for me, doing a kind of writing like this, because usually I'm either writing scripts at work or doing dramatic writing at home, and this is nonfiction writing, and it's historical writing, but it's also writing that tells a story, so it's sort of factual and dramatic at the same time. And it gives me a chance to do a kind of writing that I haven't done in a long time, probably since college, a kind of more cerebrally based writing, where you have to get the information and the words just right, but you're also trying to do it in a way, in this case, that makes it a good story too, as I mentioned before. So it's, for me as a writer, it's an interesting change of pace, and it's an interesting challenge. And there's satisfaction in it, in bringing this man's story to light and making it available for the world to know now. So it's three things. It's storytelling, it's teaching history, and it's making history. It's bringing more fullness to history. By filling in this part of it that's sort of been missing up until now, and leaving a legacy, that will last, hopefully.
I'm sure there are thousands of people, maybe not thousands, hundreds, dozens of people like Robert Russa Moton out there that have contributed to society, to the country, to the greater good of humankind, who people just don't know about, right? For us recently, up until the late 2000s, Barbara Johns, who was like the most famous figure out of this history we talk about here in Farmville. Nobody knew who she was. Now her name is everywhere. They renamed buildings. She's got a holiday. So I guess I say that to say there still isn't a definitive biography of Barbara either. But what kind of advice would you both give to someone who is trying to put something together, whether it be a book or otherwise, on their Robert Russa Moton, on their really impactful historical figure that just does not get any kind of mainstream, notoriety or recognition?
Well, I guess I would advise this. Moton was somebody that I latched onto in part because of geography, and I was so fascinated with his retirement home and the history there. And I started studying his life and became even more interested. So there are untold stories in history. We have heard nothing to take away from, men like Washington and Jefferson and Lincoln, but there have been a lot written and studied about those men. They're certainly fascinating figures, but there are lots of untold stories in history and figures who have stories that are waiting to be told. So I certainly encourage anybody who is interested in exploring that. I myself have other book ideas beyond this one that I hope will be untold, or stories that are told in a different way. But it is a process. It is something, typically a nonfiction book of this magnitude takes years to put together, between the research and the writing. I mean, there are I think it was Dumas Malone. I think it was Malone who wrote the multi-volume biography of Jefferson. He worked on those multi-volumes for, I think, 33 years. So it is a long process, but it's also worth doing because these stories need to be told. So
I agree with all of that, and I would add as a writer, when you're putting something like this together, always remember that history is interesting, but people always like a story too. So if you have a story to tell, make it a story. Really bring out the drama in it and what made this person important to history and to others and to what he was trying to do, he or she was trying to do in life. And I guess that's what I would add to that.
and just to add to what Kevin alluded to, I think us working together will make this a much better biography because I'm bringing in the history and my research background. Kevin is bringing in more literary expertise, but that he's really bringing it out as far as making it an even better story, but at the same time, without losing any of the historical validity of the story. So you see writers and many people have read books by David McCullough. McCullough himself, excellent historical researcher. He has an English background, and he writes stories in such a way where he makes you feel like you are there. That's what we're trying to do here. I'm not saying we're going to have a book that seems like it's written by David McCullough, but we're trying to move in that direction. That it's a vibrant yet historically valid story and a story that's begging to be told.
Yeah, that's one last question, and then I will give you all a chance to share some more information about the book. This is take this in whatever direction you feel like going with it, but I know this is probably a difficult one to answer. But what are just kind of one or two kind of things you find most compelling about Robert Russa Moton, or most interesting, whether they be stories or just kind of facts? I know it's it's probably hard to just put it down to one or two, but kind of if you could quantify like one or two things that you're just like, wow, like this guy, he really was into something. Like what were kind of the couple of standout things for you both about Robert Russa Moton?
Yeah. There are many incidences and events that I could reference and could spend all day doing it. One of the things that I talk about the most, that is certainly the most striking to me, and people might get tired of hearing about this, but in 1923, Robert Moton, and really there was about a 4-year period where he was involved with this, but he was instrumental in lobbying for and acquiring the Veterans Hospital that is outside of the Tuskegee campus, is still there today. And he was instrumental in lobbying to have that hospital built. It was a segregated hospital for veterans of the Great War, of World War I. And he not only advocated for the hospital to be there because most of the veterans were in the South, he also advocated for the hiring of an entirely African-American professional staff, not just the lower staff, but the professional staff, the doctors and the nurses. That did not sit well with many white people in Alabama in 1923, even though it was in conjunction with the laws, the Jim Crow laws of Alabama at the time. Some men showed up in his office and threatened his life. And these men were probably Klan members. And there is evidence that the Klan itself, per their threat, were threatening to lynch Robert Moton and burn down Tuskegee Institute. I don't believe that Booker T. Washington would have stood up in the way that Moton did. I think Washington would have entered some kind of a compromise with them. But Moton was fully prepared to give his life to be lynched if it would put an end to lynching itself. That his own lynching would bring such controversy and anguish upon the Ku Klux Klan that it would put an end to the Klan and to the lynching itself. And of course, they were instrumental in carrying out the 4,000 lynchings that took place between about 1880 and 1968. Interestingly enough, the white press sided with Moton on that, and ultimately Moton got his way. But he was willing to put his life on the line for that cause. Not to say that Booker Washington was never threatened, and his life certainly was threatened a number of times, and not to diminish Washington, but that stands out that Moton was willing to do that as a husband and a father of 5 young children. And I think that segues into my second point about Moton is his character, his general character, and his tact and his ability to get along with others is noted throughout his life. So I'll pause there because I got into that story a lot. So
that was going to be one of my points too. One of the things that impresses me overall so much about this man was his character, and how if I try to quote Shakespeare, I'm going to screw it up, but I think it's from Julius Caesar. The elements he was so gentle, and the elements so finely mixed in him that all history would stand up and say and proclaim that this was a man, or said, I'm sure I've mangled it, but it's something like that. And Shakespeare was talking there about the vital importance of a man's character in forming his life, and also in that it has a lot to do with the effect he has on other people's lives and on the world.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that's one of the standout things about Robert Moton, that he was possessed of an excellence of character that not only complimented him, but ultimately made such a difference in the world and the evolution of Black history in this country and so forth. Because this was a man who was so deeply focused inside and had such a firm moral compass about things, that he was able to quietly but firmly and perseverantly move things toward a better state of existence for Black people and for people in general, probably in this country. The other thing about him that stands out to me is that he was so. I have a cat playing with my microphone here. I'm sorry. The other thing that stands out with me about him to me is that he was simply so politically influential. Brian, you said it was 7 presidents that he knew and spoke with, and
yes.
I mean, try to compare that to anybody else in history who knew and had input to the decision-making processes of 7 U.S. presidents. It's really extraordinary, and that alone is enough to make you take a look at this man and say, wow, there must have been something going on here. This guy must have been important somehow in a way that people don't see yet, because otherwise, why would 7 U.S. presidents have cared so much about his opinion on things, and listen to him and let themselves be influenced by him in a lot of cases, probably. So I guess those are the things that, in my mind, that stand out the most, that are most impressive about him.
Both of those are great. I mean, and I work in a place named after him, and I am now more curious than I was before we started this interview to especially get into y'all's book when it's done. So I guess that brings us to the last part. How far are you along in the book? When can we get it? And then where will we be able to get access to it when it's done?
Well, we were approved in early January by the University of Alabama Press. We are now with the pandemic and working out all the details of a publishing contract. We are now, as of this week, officially signing with University of Alabama Press to publish the book. The publishing, even we're looking to be able to submit the manuscript by the end of this summer. And that is contingent upon our ability with the pandemic to get back to Tuskegee university archives to do some more research. We did go there last summer, but there are, I think, 197 boxes of Moton information there. So even spending every day for a week there is certainly not enough. So we're looking at the whole process of publishing it. We'll go through peer review. So we're, cautiously optimistic about the peer review, and by the time they go through the whole process, we're looking at a release in about 2 years. So about 2022. So even once you get a manuscript submitted, there's a process that takes about 2 years to, in the meantime, once we do that, as I said, we're interested in other books and other historical topics, some related to Moton, and mostly related to African American history. But I'm just, interested in keeping this going in other endeavors.
And I'm just here waiting for Brian to finish his chapters and send them on to me as he finishes them. And he's had a little bit more of a challenge than I have in finding enough time to work on the manuscript, I think, during his school year. But now that we're moving into the summer, the process should accelerate. I'm working part-time now. I was retired close to 3 years ago from the station before they brought me back part-time. So I have pretty good time to work on the revisions now, and I'm just waiting for the material to come to me, and we have a good ways to go yet, but over the summertime, and especially since there's not much else to do but sit inside and do something now anyway, we're really going to start working on it in earnest, completing some of the field research that still has to get done, hopefully. And by late summer, early fall, we'll have a book by George. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, we will look forward certainly to 2022. We will hope to be able to sell that here in our bookstore, certainly, and maybe bring both of you down for a book signing and maybe some sort of lecture or talk or something that we can have a program where we can get folks out to hear both of you speak.
Yeah, thank you. We look forward to it.
Yeah. So hopefully whenever, I'm not sure exactly when this interview will release on our kind of social media channels and such, but certainly COVID-19 will still be a household term. So hopefully it won't throw our viewers off that we're still talking about COVID-19 whenever this comes out.
Hopefully it'll be gone by the time we get the book released. So that would be a treat. So
that would be excellent. So yeah, so any last thoughts, anything else from you both? How can do you all have like social media information you want to share so people can follow you and keep track on what's going on?
Yeah, well, I have at this point in time, I have for about the last 3 years, I think I created a Facebook. Yeah. It's not a page, it's a group, and it involves, signing up for membership just with a request to join the group, but it's called Robert Russa Moton, America's Forgotten Civil Rights Leader. Robert Russa Moton, America's Forgotten Civil Rights Leader. And what I do is post things in there that primarily deal with my research journey. Most recently, I put on there a collage of photos, which I, in essence, called a pictorial history of Moton's life. Photos from the house in Amelia, where we think he was born, to, of course, his boyhood home there in Rice, which I'm sure you've seen, Kanan, and going up to through Tuskegee, and finally his retirement home here at Holly Knoll. I have a lot of photographs in there from my wife and I. Spent a couple days in Prince Edward County, visited the Moton Museum for the first time then, and took a lot of photographs of his boyhood home. Had a wonderful guided tour of the area of both the birthplace and the boyhood home. So those are the types of items that I post on the website. Sometimes quotes from Robert Moton, from Jenny Moton. There's a little bit on Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois as well, his contemporaries. And it's really to, you know, even prior to the book, expose the world to Moton history. So
It's a great page. I'm in it.
So
I guess
we're hoping to add to that later. Go ahead, Kevin.
Ryan just mostly covered the informational base there, but I have a Facebook page, I have a profile on LinkedIn, and if people want to get my book on Amazon and see how I write, they're welcome to do it. And I guess that's about all I can add. There's the book. Ryan is holding it up.
Might have to pick up a copy.
Okay. All right. It's
Well,
called
perfect.
In Darkness.
Perfect. Thank you both so much for your time. I know our listeners are going to get a lot out of this, and certainly want to get the name Robert Russa Moton out there a lot more than present. So I appreciate personally and professionally both of the work that both of you all are doing, and we will look forward to getting that book in 2022.
Thank you, Kanan. Thank you for this opportunity, and we look forward to talking to you more.
Of course.
We certainly do. Thanks very much.
When the pandemic is over, I hope to see you both in person, although still probably social distance, but that's okay. But it'll be good to see you both.
Yes, yes, indeed.
Well, great. Well, thank you both. If y'all need us for anything, you know where to find us. We're here. But in the meantime, stay safe and take care.
Thank you. Have a good
Same
day.
to you, Kanan. Have a great day.
Thanks. Have a good one.